And plus now, if sort of I look at the sort of the macro view, like most of the organizations initially, from what I understand, were like sort of these independent voices, but now they're just owned by these large corporate organizations. And
yeah, my thesis in university was actually on my journalism thesis was on the concentration of media ownership and how dangerous that is. And that was, I would have written that in 2008 and 2009. And that was, it was really bad then. Now, Post Media owns like every single, it used to be really bad that in New Brunswick, all the newspapers except for one small newspaper, Acadie Nouvelle, was owned by the Irvings. And that was a big problem. And it definitely impacted coverage in that province. And then Post Media came along and they bought up all the papers and they own almost every local paper. And they're not, it's not like they're coming in and injecting new life into these papers. They're kind of hacking and slashing in a lot of instances, and it's really bad. And it's like, for instance, one thing that's really important and that we're very lucky to have is a public broadcaster. You need obviously, depending on what country you're in and what the rules are, a state broadcaster or state journalism can be a serious problem because that's just a mouthpiece. You've got that with like Pravda in Russia or every news agency in China. But a public broadcaster and a state broadcaster are two very different things. A public broadcaster is arm's length, and that's why it's great that we have CBC because it's a service. It's like the post office. It's not. There's been a lot of complaints about the post office losing money lately, but the post office it's a government service. It's not really meant to generate revenue for the government in the same way that CBC is not meant to generate revenue for the government. A big problem is that CBC sells ads. They have a mandate to sell ads, but they get money from the federal government to run, and they need the money from the federal government to run, but they subsidize that with ads. So basically they used to get more money, they didn't sell ads, and then the government said, we're going to give you less money, but you can sell ads to make up the difference. The problem is that means that their advertising rates can undercut all of the other private journalism outlets, basically the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star are kind of some of the only ones out there. So their ad revenue is lower than what it should be because CBC can sell all of these ads on their website, especially the web ads is where you really see it, and CBC is subsidized by the government. So it should happen, what the government should be doing to really benefit journalism in Canada is give CBC enough money to operate without having to sell ads, make it so they can no longer sell ads. I don't know if you've ever watched CBC Gem, but it is unwatchable. It is ungoddamn watchable because they have these ads. They'll run 5 or 6 of the same ads in a row. Of exactly the same 30-second ad that you have to watch over and over and over again to try and boost the revenue number. I don't know why the UI is, like, why they have so many problems with it, but it's terrible. So my wife and I will not watch CBC Gem anymore because the advertising is so frustrating in it. But that's beside they're not doing it well is my point, but they're doing it well enough to undercut other organizations. So if CBC is out of the ad game, that gives more revenue to organizations like the Globe and Mail and Toronto Star, and that would benefit journalism in Canada massively. But in order for that to happen, the federal government needs to invest more in CBC. Right? You can't have one without the other. If they just say no more selling ads, then CBC is in real trouble. But so that's one of the unique instances in Canada. That's kind of a unique problem to us, is that we have a public broadcaster, but its ad sales are undercutting our private journalism outlets.
Without getting into like the politics of it, because I'm totally apolitical. Personally, but I've heard a lot of conversation around from Pierre Poilievre, whatever. He's like
Poilievre.
Sorry, my bad. Thank you for correcting me there. Poilievre.
No problem. It's a hard name to spell and pronounce.
Right, Poilievre, and he keeps talking about that the media is owned by Justin Trudeau and it's a mouthpiece of the government, and fair enough. Of course, he's an opponent. He's going to say a whole bunch of stuff too. But the point really here is the concept that he talks about is like, why have it subsidized and let them just make money through revenue and just be out there in sort of like a capitalist kind of environment?
I have an answer for that, which is that as we discussed, journalists are in many ways the defender of democracy. And I mean, journalists are flawed human people like everyone else, but you need someone watching City Hall. You have to have someone watching City Hall. There is not enough money for that now. The journalism industry has failed in Canada and is a shell of its former self. And we've got pretty much the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, which is nothing like it used to be, and even the Globe and Mail has really shrunk, and CBC. If we're going to have journalists holding the government accountable, we need the CBC. And the idea that the CBC is a mouthpiece of the government is outrageously false. It is so completely untrue. CBC is so afraid, and I worked very closely with people in CBC for a very long time. They are so afraid of being labeled as having a liberal bias that they will almost always err on the side of being very conservative, or at least being more neutral than they should be when there's like a very clear answer to some question, but it might be on the liberal side of things. They'll give space to someone opposing it, even if they have like no grounding in fact whatsoever. Sometimes, so there is no liberal bias at the CBC. If anything, there's a conservative bias because they're afraid of being labeled. They're exactly afraid of this kind of thing. And the fact is, it can't compete in the free market. It just can't. And the free market, we don't really have a free market in Canada to begin with. It's one thing to have, however you feel about socialism, the social welfare state. I think most people generally agree that we shouldn't be socializing corporations. But we do live in a country where, Air Canada gets, they fail and fail and fail again, and the government bails them out. We have the subprime mortgage crisis hit Canada, not as hard as the States, but economically it did, and corporations were bailed out. Corporations were bailed out during COVID, and I think the COVID was a little bit different because there was a lot of gap loans and things like that to keep businesses running, ARF included actually, and we benefited from that. That's a little bit different, but oftentimes there's big bailouts for these companies that the government will do. So it's not like we're really living in a truly Smithian economics, free hand of the market anyway. The government's coming in and interfering and helping out the big established players rather than allowing the market to correct for itself. So, but the fact is, if we allow journalism to just exist in the free market when it has failed, there needs to be federal support for this to happen. There just does. There isn't enough money in the market. There isn't a model that works to generate it. The New York Times is successful because they have such a huge subscriber base. I subscribe to the New York Times, right? I also subscribe to Canadian outlets, but the New York Times, because it's international, it has a huge audience. The Hamilton Spectator doesn't have that audience, and it never will. And the way that it works, if you don't want people getting all of their news off of Twitter, and even if people are going to get all their news off of Twitter, but if you want some organizations with reliable actual journalists who are following the principles of objectivity and doing their research and investigating, you want them publishing the narrative to at least counterbalance some of the crazier stuff that's out there on social media. So in that sense, yeah, we need there needs to be government support for this.
By the way, I agree with you on a couple of those fronts, and in fact, there's I think there's another sort of marketing person I follow, Rory Sutherland, and he was talking about, maybe, for example, Twitter has, or X or whatever, has some sort of a model where you have like money sitting in that account, and then every time you want to read an article, you just say, okay, I'll pay for this, and you pay like 50 cents or $1 for the article that you want to read.
Micropayments, that's something that they've been talking about implementing since back when I first started in journalism, and no one's successfully done it.
Yeah, of course.
It's a good idea, but no one successfully implemented it.
I would also argue that a lot of the tech and solutions, sometimes they were, from a timing perspective, maybe too early. Maybe there are some new models to be explored.
But when you talk about that micropayment thing, you talk about, on Twitter, if someone goes and clicks on an article and they get a little balance taken out of them, or on Facebook, someone goes in and gets it, or on Google, they go in and they get it and a little thing comes out. That's essentially what the government subsidy for media, not with the CBC, but the other subsidy, the tax on Facebook and Google and Twitter, on social media platforms. That's essentially what that's doing. Is it's saying like, you're generating a certain percentage of your traffic because of these online articles that people are clicking through, and you're generating revenue off of ad sales for that. So you've got to share some of your ad revenue with these media sources. And the thing is, the companies will not do that on their own, because Facebook said, Google agreed, what the government said, we are doing this, we're going to force you to do this. If you want to exist in Canada, you have to comply with this. Google agreed. I'm not sure where Twitter is on it. And I'm not going to call it X. I don't care what Elon Musk wants. It's Twitter to me. But Facebook freaked out and said, all right, if you're going to make us pay this, we're not doing it. We're going to delist all news in Canada. So if you're a news organization in Canada, you are no longer on Facebook. They kicked all of them off of Facebook. So the idea that like you're right, that's a model that could work, but there's no economic incentive for the companies to do it, because they're already getting they're right now getting all of the money from the ad sales that the content from news sites are generating on their platforms. They don't want to share it. And if you want a perfect example of what it looks like when they're kind of made to share it, Facebook picked up their ball and went home. Right? They said, if you're going to make us do this, we're so opposed to giving even a tiny, just a tiny pittance of a percentage of the profits they're making in Canada, an absolutely infinitesimally small amount of it to share as a profit sharing revenue. Instead, they just delisted all the news websites. So the idea that the free market is going to provide for that it hasn't. And when the government came up with a solution that would work, Facebook said no, and took a pretty extreme measure to do it.
We're in a world of I try to go deep. I'm really generally very curious, come from a place of inquiry and try to learn different perspectives. And you typically end up hearing one perspective and you're like, okay, let me find the opposite of this. So that's why that was actually really helpful.
Oh, and one other key thing is that Google, I think part of the reason why Google Canada, and I don't know if he's still there, but he was their head of communications when I was at CJFE, and I think he was promoted pretty high up. He might even be, I think he was running all of Google Canada at the time. His name's Aaron Brindle, and he was a journalist. So it's not surprising that Google Canada agreed to participate, because they happen to have a journalist very highly placed in the organization, a former journalist. If it wasn't, something tells me, now again, this is pure speculation on my part. I have no idea whether this is fully true or not. I just know that there was a guy high placed at Google that was a journalist, and Facebook didn't participate, but Google did. And something tells me that Google probably would have been a lot less likely to if it wasn't for someone advocating for this inside, assuming that happened. Again, I don't actually know if that's the case, but that's what my gut tells me.
I would say that's such a great example of having diversity of thought and perspective in the leadership on your business, because now they can understand and have empathize and see, otherwise if somebody's not a journalist, they don't get it. They don't understand the value of finding all that stuff that we were talking about earlier in the conversation.